Perfect. I think we're recording now. So it's the Wednesday morning on week 8, and this session we were really gonna go through the material for the exam 2, and I started already with a student, and we kind of concluded that the chapter or the week on the lymphatic and immune system could use a little bit of revision. So we're going to make a start with that, and we'll use the study guide to kind of guide us through that material once we've reviewed the most important slides. So I'm going to jump out of this presentation to another one, so bear with me. And I think we have the presentation here. I think that the lymphatic and immune system are one of those chapters that kind of reminds me of what we covered on the endocrine system, that there's a lot to go through, and it's very easy that it starts to feel like a little bit of an overwhelming topic, because to really understand everything, you kind of have to understand so much more than what we can cover in this session. So for that reason, we're gonna just kind of have to stick to the basics. And when you stick to the basics, there's always going to be some empty gaps there. But what I'll do, I'll pick out the most important slides from here. So we're going to start by going quickly through the lymphatic system at the first part. And from the lymphatic system, I would like to highlight 3 main functions that we have for lymphatic system. And I'm sorry about the scribbles. I wrote them during the last review session when we went through the lymphatic system. So they're not as pretty as they could be, but I'll try to be very clear of what I'm writing. And before I get too much further, I'll just mention as a quick shout out, if you're looking for the lecture recordings or the review session recordings from this week's Monday, unfortunately I was all alone, so no one showed up, so I didn't record myself just sitting around. So if you're wondering why they didn't show up, that's why. But I might try to look up from last year if I have some good recordings from. But what we're going to do now, we're going to focus on the lymphatic system, and there's 3 main functions that we give for that we have identified for the lymphatic system. And they all will become much clearer once we go through the lecture material, but I think it's a good idea to start with those. And that would be a cue for you that that's probably going to be important content for this chapter to take away. So this really applies for both systems, but if we're looking especially the lymphatic system, probably the most important function of these is going to be fighting against various diseases. So lymphatic system serves almost as a site or as a structure within which the immune system functions. So it offers the physical structures where the immune system does its job. And both of these are focused on fighting diseases. So anything that enters to your body and shouldn't be there, we call those things pathogens. And we're going to talk about pathogens a little later when we look at the immune system. But these pathogens are something that has invaded to your body, shouldn't be there. And it is the lymphatic and immune system that's job it is to deal with those. So that's probably the first and most important and often also most obvious function for the lymphatic system. The 2 other functions are functions that become much more clearer as we review the material, and you'll see the special adaptations that we have. So the second one that I want to highlight is the function of the lymphatic system in balancing the fluids in the body. So we have various different compartments in the body, as you learned during the BIO201, and we can look at that on various different levels. And here we can, for example, look at it as if we have fluids within the cardiovascular system, within the cells, and then in the place between those, which is the interstitial fluid. In addition to that, we have fluid sometimes more in the, let's say, for the at the lower limbs, abdomen, thoracic cavity, upper limbs, or so on and so on. There's many places. But what lymphatic system helps us to do, it helps us to make sure that those fluids don't end up building to only one location, so that they are transported wherever the fluids are needed. So that's the second function of the lymphatic system, to make sure that the fluid balance is maintained. And if fluids start building up to one area, it is the lymphatic system that helps with making sure that we then collect that fluid from that area and take it wherever it is needed. And the third function is something that we often don't hear about, and I think textbooks often as well just mainly mention it, but don't go into detail. But I have spent a lot of my time in my career teaching nutritional sciences as well. And it turns out that we have, of course, our digestive system, which function is to grab the energy and the nutrients for our body to do its job. But it turns out that the digestive system has its limitations. And the limitations are mainly due to the fact that cardiovascular system is only able to pick up molecules up to a certain size. If you think of what we learned earlier on about the blood vessels, and that it was the capillaries where the exchange of materials happened. So that was where material crossed into the blood, which would be the case in the digestive system. But it turns out that the blood vessel capillaries cannot take in very large fat molecules. These fat molecules are simply too big to enter into those capillaries. So that's where we recruit the lymphatic system to help us with that. Because it turns out that the lymphatic system's capillaries, they're able to collect much larger molecules. So rather than picking the large fat molecules simply through the cardiovascular system's capillaries, we actually use lymphatic system to pick those up. And then lymphatic system transports them close to the heart, and then close at the heart, dumps it into the cardiovascular system, into the vasculature, into the blood vessels that then continue carrying these large fats. So it's kind of like a roundabout way to get the materials into the body. So those are the three important functions that we have for the lymphatic system. And at any stage, if you have questions, just shout out. But like I said, I'm going to try to focus on the very, very important topics. So let's have a look what else we could highlight from the lymphatic system. Well, this relates to what I just discussed earlier on, that it is the lymphatic system that we see here that works very closely with the cardiovascular system. You can think of these two being related almost as if the cardiovascular system was the plumbing or let's say the water pipes in the house, and the lymphatic system was the plumbing. So you can't really have the water pipes if you don't have another system to pick up whatever escapes out of those water pipes. So we don't throw away, we don't lose all of the water that we take from the water pipe. Some of it we use, and whatever is left over that we don't use, it was the plumbing that picked that up. Well, the same concept goes with the cardiovascular system, the blood vessels, and then the lymphatic vessels. So lymphatic vessels pick up whatever we don't have staying inside the blood vessels. So that's how those two are related. And the clinical relevance that relates to the lymphatic system really is when you go and see a doctor. And doctor, one of the first things, if you say that, oh, I feel I have an infection or I feel sick, it might be an infection of some kind, or if the doctor suspects that there's an infection, they check for your lymph nodes. And we have lymph nodes in various different places in our body. But one of the places where it's very easily accessible is here at the level of the neck. What the doctor wants to do is pick two things. First of all, whether these lymph nodes are swollen. And if these lymph nodes are swollen, that's often a sign that the lymphatic and immune system is activated. So there's now a lot going on, because what really happens is that the size of the lymph nodes grows because there's going to be more cells in there, and we get more cells in response if there is an infection. So it is the lymphatic and immune system that get activated, and especially the immune system. If there is an infection, if there is one of these pathogens that has entered your body, and when it gets activated, the immune system cells proliferate. So there's going to be much more these immune system cells. And where the immune system cells mainly hang about is at the lymph nodes. So the lymph nodes physically grow. So that's what the doctor is trying. Another thing that the doctor is checking, that whether they feel sensitive, whether you say that, yeah, it hurts, or yeah, it doesn't feel great when you touch them. So those are the two things that the doctor would be looking for: the swelling, and then whether they are sensitive to touch. Well, this slide is kind of giving us an outline of everything that we cover in the chapter of the lymphatic system, what we need to know about the lymphatic system. So we start with the lymphatic vessels. So just like we had blood vessels, we have lymphatic vessels, and we're going to go through these vessels quickly. Then we're going to have a look at what the lymph actually is. What is the lymph? How is it similar to other things that we've seen, or how is it dissimilar to other things that we've seen? And finally, we'll talk a little bit about the lymph nodes. So this picture reminds us from the cardiovascular system that we saw. So we have here a blood vessel where the blood is traveling. And this would be a capillary vessel in the context that we're thinking. So it's just what we saw earlier on. Blood is traveling within the capillary. And it goes one way and one way only. You remember our cardiovascular system was unidirectional. It transports blood to one direction only. But what we end up noticing, that there's various forces that act. And I think that we finished our chapter on the vasculature on this concept, and I didn't talk too much about it. But these few different forces act with the purpose of transporting some of the materials out of the blood vessels. And this force was known as hydrostatic pressure, and the other force was osmotic pressure. And osmotic pressure put things into the blood vessel. And this process of moving materials in and out of the blood vessel or the capillary, it was known as capillary filtration. So that was the exchange of materials. And some of the things that we exchange is that, for example, we take oxygen to the tissues. So blood is used to transport the oxygen until we get to the capillaries, and then capillaries give away the oxygen to the tissues. In addition, we transported nutrients. So all the tissues in the body will need oxygen, and all the tissues in the body will need nutrients and energy to do their job and have those building blocks to build whatever those tissues need to build, whether it's just building themselves or if it's something else. So energy is another thing that we transport with the blood, and then we give away at the side of the capillaries to the tissues. Well, what we pick up instead is going to be carbon dioxide, which was the waste product of the cellular metabolism. So the cells, when they do their job, when, for example, ATP is produced, we are left with carbon dioxide. And if we don't get rid of that carbon dioxide in the tissue, we would actually get sick. And a good way of getting rid of that is then giving it to the blood and have blood to transport it, for example, to our lungs, and then we breathe out most of that carbon dioxide. Small amount of the carbon dioxide, we have other ways of getting rid of that, and we'll look at those later in this course. But for now, you just need to think of that some of the carbon dioxide is taken away from the tissues. That's all we worry about. In addition, there's going to be other waste products that we are left with. And those other waste products as well are then put back into the blood and taken away from those tissues. So this all should be kind of a review of what we've talked about. And really the big thing that I wanted to draw our attention here was these two forces that caused it to happen. Hydrostatic force pushing the outside or pushing out from the capillaries, and osmotic pressure pushing back into the capillaries. So if everything was ideal, in an ideal world, these forces would be balanced. There would be just as much hydrostatic force as there would be osmotic force, and the overall amount of the blood would be the same when it comes into this area as it is when it leaves this area. So if everything was balanced, that would be what happened. Well, we end up finding that there's not always cells immediately next to the capillaries. Sometimes next to the capillaries, there's some amount of space before we get to the cells. And this space between the cells and also other structures such as blood vessels is known as extracellular space or extracellular matrix. And you don't have to worry about that. You can just think of that there is some empty space between the cells and also between the cells and blood vessels. And this empty space is filled with plasma. So it is plasma of the blood that escapes. It's not going to be red blood cells. It's not going to be white blood cells. It's not going to be platelets. What escapes with the hydrostatic pressure is going to be plasma of the blood that ends up leaving from the blood vessels. Well, it turns out that this plasma gets another name once we get to this space, this extracellular matrix between the cells outside the blood vessels. We now talk about interstitial fluid. So rather than saying that it was plasma, the word plasma is reserved only to the material inside the blood vessel. So once it leaves the blood vessel, it becomes now interstitial fluid. So interstitial fluid is exactly the same in its composition as plasma. There's no differences, but we just use a different name because rather than being here, we're now here. So don't let that confuse you. It's the same stuff. Even if we look at its composition, if we look at what it's made of, it is exactly the same. Well, interstitial fluid was this fluid that was located between the cells. And if you think that we would end up in a situation where these numbers that we discussed, the amount of fluids coming in and leaving the area, are not in balance, we might end up with more interstitial fluid in between the cells than there was before. And this would be then, of course, the edema, when we see that a structure of the body starts swelling because too much plasma escapes to that area. So we say that there's now excess interstitial fluid there. Well, let's have a look at some of the numbers, because I'm sure you could make sense that with the introduction that it's not going to be in balance. The amount of fluids coming in and amount of fluids leaving is not going to be in balance. So we're going to start by looking at the fluids that result from the hydrostatic pressure. So the amount of fluids that escapes the capillaries to this extracellular matrix space and becomes interstitial fluid. That's going to be 20 liters in a day. And 20 liters is a lot. But we don't end up really swelling a lot during the day because we also have the osmotic pressure. So some of it gets picked back in. And it is going to be 17 liters of plasma. And remember, we now use the word interstitial fluid rather than plasma. 17 liters of that actually gets picked back into the capillaries. So if my math serves me correct, that leaves us with 3 liters of extra interstitial fluid every day. So every day we have between the cells this plasma, which we now call interstitial fluid, 3 liters of that. Well, if you think of 3 liters, that's still quite a lot. And 3 liters, if we ended up with 3 liters of interstitial fluid being added to the space between the cells every day, we would quickly start swelling over a few days. We would end up looking like elephant men, or we would end up looking like those Michelin characters. I think that's their logo. Well, so we need to do something with these 3 liters. And this is where the lymphatic system steps in. And I'll tell you how it's going to help in a second. But what I want to show on this slide is these 3 terms that are going to be important for us to know. So we're talking of the same stuff, but we call it different depending on what part of the body or what part of the system we're looking at. So within the blood, we had plasma. And plasma was that liquidy part. It didn't include cells. And this plasma was transported within the blood vessels, and this example that we looked within these capillaries. Well, some of this plasma escaped, and it now became interstitial fluid. So that's the term that we use now that we have had a look of what the proper name. So rather than calling it plasma, now we call it interstitial fluid. And it is the exact same thing. Well, once interstitial fluid gets picked up by the lymphatic system, we talk about lymph. And again, it is the exact same material. It's the same composition. It's the same stuff that we had in plasma. It's the same stuff that we had in interstitial fluid. But this time we call it lymph. And the key answer here is when it enters the... Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Ooh, sorry. Let's get back there. When it enters to the lymphatic vessels, we call it lymph. So until this material enters in to the lymphatic system, it's going to be interstitial fluid. But when the lymphatic system picks up this material, it becomes lymph. And this is going to be one of the questions in the exam, that when does interstitial fluid become lymph? And the correct answer to that would be when it enters the lymphatic vessels, when it enters the lymphatic system. Until it gets back into the lymphatic system, or until it enters the lymphatic system, we still keep calling it interstitial fluid. So that's really the basics of how are we left with lymph. That kind of explains the relationship between how do we get lymph and how do these vessels relate to that. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about these lymphatic vessels before we wrap up with them. But at this stage, I've just highlighted in the previous class that we had that remember that the lymphatic and immune system were related, and the lymphatic system was really the structures within which the immune system worked. So I just had it in a later slide. We already talked about it. So here what we have is a representation of our cardiovascular system. You remember that we talked about the heart, that we could draw the heart as this box that had 4 different chambers that we saw. I'm just going to change the color so it's not all going to be same color. So the heart was this structure where we had 4 different chambers, and some of the blood from the heart went to the lungs. So this drawing here is trying to be lungs. I know that it's a bit of a crappy drawing, but we'll live with it. And the blood went to lungs so that it could pick up oxygen and it could get rid of carbon dioxide. And then this blood returned back to the heart. This loop was our pulmonary loop. So that was our pulmonary loop. But we remember that we had another loop as well. In this loop, this blood that was rich in oxygen left the heart and it traveled to the capillaries. And from the capillaries, it returned back to the heart. And while it left the heart, this part was rich in oxygen. And when it came back to the heart, now it didn't have a lot of oxygen, instead of it had carbon dioxide. So this is really the basic concept that we saw for the systemic circuit. So that loop we've talked about already earlier on. So it's the systemic loop that we're going to be looking at. Of course, the pulmonary loop that we saw here, that's important too, but we're now focusing on the systemic loop. And you remember we talked about different kinds of parts that make up the cardiovascular system, the vascular parts. We have arteries, we had arterioles, we had capillaries, we had venules, and then we had veins. So this all is something that we've seen before. And a couple of things that we notice about this, how the blood travels within the vascular system, is that it's going to be one-way system. So blood travels only to one direction. And in addition, this loop is closed, so there's no gaps anywhere. So all of these are tubes that are connected to the following tubes. So it is a closed loop system. Well, now, let's lay on top of this diagram that I think we should be comfortable, the lymphatic system. Well, lymphatic system is all this green stuff that we see here. So the lymphatic system starts where we have these capillaries. So we have various lymphatic vessels there, and these were the lymphatic capillaries. And these capillaries transport the lymph that these collect further up, and the vessels get bigger and thicker and bigger and thicker until they reach the blood vessel just before the heart. So just like a tree branch, it gets thicker and thicker and thicker as we approach to the actual body of the tree. The furthest away, the most distal capillaries, they're the thinnest in terms of their diameter. But what we'll notice that unlike the cardiovascular system where we had this closed loop, lymphatic system is an open-ended system. It's open from this end. And it is just like we saw one directional system, we saw that also with the cardiovascular vasculature. So it only transports lymph to one direction. So to do that, what we actually have in the lymphatic vessels is the exact same structure as we had in capillaries. There's various valves. And this diagram here is trying to show the valves. They look very similar to what we saw in our veins. In addition, another thing that we see with the lymphatic system is that we then start having these lymph nodes. These are blobs around the lymph vessels. So we'll talk about these blobs a little later, but you remember these blobs were what the doctor was feeling for in the neck of someone, for example, to identify if they had a lot of white blood cells inside them, which was a sign that the number of white blood cells grows whenever a pathogen enters to your body. So that was a sign that your body was fighting an infection. So I hope this makes sense so far. And what we're going to do now, we're going to go through all of these vessels that we see here, starting from the smallest one, the capillaries, and then going to bigger and thicker ones as we move through this system. So we'll start from the smallest vessels and then we'll look at the thickest vessels. And the smallest vessels are going to be the capillaries. So just like cardiovascular system had capillaries, lymphatic system as well has capillaries. So that's the first kind of a vessel structure that we look at. And what becomes obvious about this lymphatic system, capillaries, is that they're very similar. The only big difference is that they're much more permeable. So they take up material even easier than the cardiovascular capillaries could take up. So lymphatic system is great at collecting stuff. And again, if you think of this, that we had the water lines in a house, and then we had the drainage system. And the drainage system was what the lymphatic system is. So we want to collect everything possible that could come out of here. So we make it much more permeable. So it's very, very good at picking up stuff. And one of the things that we noticed that it was very good at picking was very large molecules or particles. So things that are much bigger than what the cardiovascular system could pick up. And one example of these was, of course, our dietary fats. And that was one of the functions that we found for the lymphatic system. So picking up those large fat molecules that were too big for the cardiovascular system to pick up in the capillaries. And this would be an example of one molecule that would be large. We could think that it's, for example, this dietary fat. And I'm just going to jump to our very first slide that we saw here, that one of the functions was picking up these dietary fats. So let's go back where we were here. So it was the capillaries that were the smallest vessels in the lymphatic system. And these capillaries, the only thing that we really need to notice is that they're much more permeable and able to take larger molecules than what we saw in the cardiovascular capillaries. Well, after we've talked about the capillaries, the next type of vessels that we'll notice in the lymphatic system, we're going to go to bigger one and bigger one and bigger one. And at this point, I just had highlighted a couple of examples. This is a picture of the thoracic cavity. So we have our trachea more anteriorly, and then posteriorly at the behind, we have our esophagus going to the stomach. Trachea went to the lungs. We also have our superior vena cava. That was the big vein that brought blood to the heart from the upper parts of the body, so upper limbs, head, neck. And we have inferior vena cava. We've cut the inferior vena cava quite low there. It would keep going up until we get to the heart. An inferior vena cava was a vein that brought all the blood from the rest of the body to the heart. Well, when we look at this diagram, we'll notice that now we've added a couple of lymphatic structures to this diagram. And these are just structures that are anatomically good to know. Let's have a look at those. So first of all, through the entire thoracic cavity, we at the very back, against the vertebral column, we have this long lymphatic vessel that runs, and it's going to be called thoracic duct. So duct tells us that it's a really, really thick one. And at the end of the thoracic duct, at the bottom of the thoracic cavity, we have this expansion of it. And this is known as cisterna chyli. So this is just an anatomical structure, an anatomical name for this expansion. So it's not like this is the most important topic or important part of the chapter, but these are a couple of anatomical structures that I just really wanted to highlight to you so you know that there's these structures. So we have our thoracic duct, which was this running within the thoracic cavity at the posterior part of it, at the back, the entire distance of the thoracic cavity, and at the bottom, most inferiorly, we have this expansion known as cisterna chyli. But like I said, not the most important thing you need to know. The important stuff that we're going to look at the terminology. So once we go to bigger vessels, now we've talked about capillaries, and we talked a little bit about general vessels. But next, we're going to look at the trunks. And I don't remember if this is the third or second. So we're going to talk about different kinds of lymphatic trunks. And lymphatic trunks, there's many that we find in the body. And what you'll notice that they are named based on the location where in the body we end up seeing. So let's have a look at a couple of examples of the trunks that we can see. So we have lumbar trunk. It supplies the lumbar region of the body. We also have interstitial trunk, so it supplies the intestines of the body. And you remember here, we talked about that in addition to cardiovascular system picking up energy and nutrients, the lymphatic system stepped in when we had these large dietary fat molecules that couldn't be picked up by the cardiovascular system's capillaries. They were too big to enter in there. So intestinal trunk of the lymphatic vessels is important in that sense, that it is supplied there. Then we have intercostal trunk. Intercostal trunk serves the space between the ribs. So costal refers to the ribs, and intercostal is the space between the ribs. So it drains everything from between the ribs that does not get drained by the cardiovascular system's capillaries. Then we have bronchomediastinal trunk. You remember mediastinum was the space between the lungs. So that's where the heart was located and the big blood vessels. That's the mediastinum. And broncho refers that it also covers the bronchi of the body. We also have subclavian trunk draining the area or going underneath the clavicle. So just like we had subclavian artery and vein, we have subclavian lymphatic vessel. So that's going to be subclavian trunk of the lymphatic system. And then we have jugular trunk. Jugular drained or passed on the neck, just like we had a jugular vein, jugular artery. So those were our trunks. When we move to bigger vessels than trunks, now we start talking about ducts. So this is one step bigger than what we've seen so far. Let's look at where we can find different kinds of ducts. We can find, for example, right lymphatic duct. Right lymphatic duct is the big structure that drains the upper limb and the head and neck. And right lymphatic duct empties its contents here just before the heart to right subclavian vein. So this is the structure when I said that when the lymphatic system has carried all the lymph close to the heart, it connects to the cardiovascular system. And the vessel that it connects to is going to be the subclavian vein. And we have on the left-hand side, similarly, we have the thoracic duct. And again, thoracic duct, it drained then our left side of the upper limb and neck, and it emptied its contents to the left subclavian vein. So both on the right and left side, the lymphatic system eventually ends up dumping its contents to the subclavian. And subclavian then runs directly to the heart. So this is how, when we had this initial diagram that we saw, that we had some of the blood escaping the cardiovascular system and some of it was picked back up, but we were left with these extra 3 liters. Well, these extra 3 liters gets picked up by the lymphatic system and carried by it until it gets to the subclavian ducts, and it dumps everything to the subclavian veins. So this is carried in another way. And it was carried by this lymphatic system that was open from one end, carried everything. And once we get here, this connection, this was our subclavian. So that's kind of anatomy heavy, and I'm not really expecting you to spend too much time on the anatomy, but as long as you know, because you have the anatomy practical, that's what tests your anatomy, but as long as you know that the lymphatic system collected all that leaked out from the cardiovascular system, and then it carried it through bigger and bigger and bigger lymphatic vessels until it reached the left and right subclavian. And we actually saw that here in our earlier diagram when we talked earlier. And this is just to highlight what we already noticed, that whenever we have some lymph that doesn't get picked up, if we didn't pick up all of the lymph correctly, we are left with lymphedema. And you okay? That was my cat meowing. And lymphedema is like any other edema, so swelling of the body, but it is caused now by the lymph. And it is caused by lymph building up to a certain area. It didn't just have to be that lymph could be either as an interstitial fluid in this extracellular space, or it could be in the lymphatic system. It can be also in various parts of your body, so upper limbs, lower limbs, and so on. And here we see example of the upper limb where we have lymphedema. And we see an example of the lower limb where we have lymphedema. And what you'll notice is that lymphedema is rarely on both sides of the body. So that's a good clue to you that it is going to be edema because it's only on one side of the body. This area that we're seeing here is not getting drained properly. The lymph that builds up there, that gets building up and building up and building up every day. And it was the 3 liters a day, so pretty quickly it's going to swell significantly. So what could cause that to happen? Why could you end up with lymphedema? Well, we have something that blocks the picking up the lymph. So the lymphatic vessels are blocked by something, and that causes that the lymph cannot be collected properly. And when the lymph cannot be collected properly, it ends up building to this area. And this blockage can be, for example, something that grows where it shouldn't grow, like tumors or so on. Sometimes to treat certain conditions, we might need to remove lymphatic vessels in your body. And if we remove lymphatic vessels, it might be that then the lymph doesn't get drained properly, and that part starts to swell, and it has now lymphedema. Well, the good news is that there is a chance that over time, this actually gets better spontaneously, that we don't need to do anything to treat this. This is because the lymphatic pathways from other areas that were not initially draining that part, they find other routes to get in there. And that's how the situation can improve over time. Now we're ready to move on. I showed you that we were going to cover first the lymphatic vessels. We've talked about them, so that's ticked off. And now the next thing we're going to talk about is going to be the lymph. So let's have a look what we know about the lymph. And lymph, really, we remembered that lymph was the exactly same contents as the plasma. So plasma was the term that we used when we talked about it being within the blood. That's the same thing as interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid and plasma were the same thing. And so was the lymph. It's just different terms depending on where in the body we are at. So if we look at the lymph, lymph is exactly the same composition as was our plasma. So we have a lot of water, we have proteins, then we have various other compounds. Now that we are going to the lymphatic system, we can add also white blood cells there, because the white blood cells were housed within the lymph nodes. So although this part is exactly the same as plasma, now we add the white blood cells there. One thing that you should never see in the lymph is red blood cells. You don't want to see red blood cells in lymph. And this is a really good picture of a test tube full of lymph. You'll notice it's this kind of a milky whitish color. And lymph is actually made in your bone marrow. So the location where lymph is made is in your bone marrow. So this is sometimes why we need to look at the other systems to understand another system. So to understand the lymphatic system, we need to remember our skeletal system. So we remember that within the bones at the center, especially of the long bones, we had the bone marrow, and bone marrow is now where the lymph is being made. And then the lymph gets mainly it gets passed by the lymphatic vessels to the lymph nodes. And lymph nodes are enlarged areas of the lymphatic system, lymphatic vessels, where we filter the lymph. We're kind of screening that is there something that shouldn't be there. And that's also where the white blood cells at large live. So that's our lymph. We don't need to know anything more about the lymph. That's all. And the last thing that we have to talk about is going to be then various lymphatic cells. So big topic on that is going to be the nodes. But we'll talk about lymphatic cells to start. So there's two types of lymphatic cells. The first ones that we'll talk about just quickly now and more in the next part of this chapter are going to be T cells and B cells. You remember that T cells were called T cells because they went to mature within the thymus. So that's where they go to mature, and that's why we call them T cells. T for thymus. B cells matured within the bone marrow, so we call them for that reason the B cells. And both of these cell types, they're really kind of covered well on the next chapter. In addition to that, we got a bunch of supporting cells, but we're not going to worry about them. So let's have a look of the these cell level things that we need to know. Really what I want to show is that we have general lymphatic tissue that's everywhere in the body. We can't really say too much about it. It's just everywhere. But then we have specialized structures. First of the specialized structures that we're going to see is going to be the lymph nodes. And this is what we'll talk a lot in the next part. And then we also have lymphatic organs. It's not just the lymph nodes, but certain organs are part of the lymphatic system. So we'll talk about those briefly as well. So let's start with the lymph nodes. So lymph nodes, if you remember, these were these glands that were kind of enlarged parts of the lymphatic system. And they end up enlarging, growing bigger if there is an infection. And this was when I said that the white blood cells that live inside the lymph nodes, they start to proliferate. And for that reason, they start growing in size. And there's hundreds of lymph nodes throughout your body. And really their main function is to fight against these pathogens. So something that shouldn't be in your body, well, lymph nodes, they are the site where the fight against those is coordinated from, and that's where it mainly happens. So what they do, we can give two functions. First function, to fight against pathogens. The first way how they do it is that they filter the lymph. So lymph gets filtered within these lymph nodes. In addition, it is where the immune system functions. So we had these two chapters covered together because immune system is an important part of what the lymph nodes exist for. So the immune system, white blood cells, they do their job within these lymph nodes. And there's many areas where we find these lymph nodes, and usually they're found as clusters, so a bunch of lymph nodes in one area. And let's have a look of those where we might find them. The ones that we saw that the doctor typically checks were at the neck region. These are known as cervical lymph nodes. So again, named based on the area. We had axillary lymph nodes. That's at the armpit. So we actually can have, if we have an infection and you feel your lymph nodes swollen, you probably will feel at the neck, you probably will feel them swollen at the armpit as well. And they're easily accessible there, just as they were at the neck. You also have lymph nodes at the supratrochlear region. So just above the trochlear notch, so on the other side of where your elbow is. You have lymph nodes at your inguinal area, so at your groin area. And for obvious reasons, doctors don't really go and check that as the first one. We have other areas that are easier to check. But it could be that there's swelling there. We have also abdominal lymph nodes, so at the abdomen. And finally, thoracic lymph nodes at the thoracic region, at the thorax. So that's how we name the areas where the lymph nodes are being found. But what we're going to do, we're going to have a look of an individual lymph node in a little bit more detail. And we'll notice that the lymph node is enclosed inside a capsule. So it's inside this kind of a sac or outer layer. That's capsular. And lymph node can be divided into two parts. We have the cortex and then we have the medulla. So just like we had with other structures that we had a look of adrenal gland where we had cortex and medulla. You have a cortex of the brain, and so on and so on. Similar to that, we can divide lymph node into cortex and medulla. And here we actually see really nice microscopic image where the staining has been used to separate the cortex and medulla. So just different colored stains get picked up by these different tissues. Another thing that we end up seeing within the lymph nodes are sinuses. Sinus is some kind of an empty space within any tissue or organ. We often talk that you can have a sinus infection, so some of those bones of the skull, of the facial area, where you have sinuses, so empty spaces inside those bones, they can get infected. So sinuses of the lymph nodes are just these spaces inside the lymph node where we have kind of an empty area, if you wish. What I also wanted to show about the lymph nodes, that we had few different kinds of vessels. We had afferent lymphatic vessels, and this means that they are coming in. So that's when something enters a structure, that's an afferent. They come in to the lymph node. And notice that the afferent vessels are kind of on this larger concave surface. Lymph travels through the lymphatic node and then it leaves the lymph node on this smaller concaved side. So what leaves is going to be called efferent. And I often think of it as synonym to exiting. So afferent, in, you can think of it arriving there. That's how I think of it. Afferent when something comes in, efferent when something leaves, exits. Okay. Really, the only thing that I have here to mention anymore was what we already discussed about these swollen lymph nodes, swollen glands, and they are very tender, they're very sensitive to touch, in addition to swelling. And this is because now there's a lot of white blood cells within these lymph nodes, these glands. If there is no pain, that's a little bit more concerning. Normally, if your lymph nodes are swollen, we want you to be able to feel the pain because it is swelling, it is bigger than it should be. If there's no pain, then we, as our medical doctor, will do a little bit of looking more. What else could it be? And the last thing for the lymphatic system that we have to look at were the different lymphatic organs. And some of these we've seen before, some are going to be new. So let's go through them quickly. So first one that we'll have a look is the structure called spleen. So spleen is about a fist-sized structure located on the left side of the abdominal cavity, just below the stomach. You can see the stomach here. And it is actually the largest lymphatic organ. And it has many different functions. But before we talk about those, you might remember spleen from when you studied the blood vessels. We had splenic artery and splenic vein. They supplied the spleen. So now you actually see where they were going to. One of the interesting functions, other than just kind of doing the immune surveillance and response, that spleen has is that in an embryo, in a baby that's still developing and hasn't been born, embryo and fetus, especially as an embryo, that's where the red blood cells are produced. The production of red blood cells then gets taken over by other parts when you grow older. But in an embryonic new start of a life, developing baby, that's where the red blood cells are also produced. What else spleen does? It collects the elements when we break down red blood cells in adults. So we break down red blood cell into various components. the heme groups, iron, and so on. That's where they are stored, these broken elements that we can reuse to make new red blood cells. And there's two different compartments within within the spleen, white pulp and red pulp. Sometimes if you have an accident where your spleen gets ruptured, your spleen may need to be removed, and that would be known as splenectomy. So that's what would happen. Often spleen is able to repair itself unless the damage is really bad. And the next structure that I wanted to talk about was our tonsils. So we have a bunch of different kinds of tonsils, and they get named based on their location. So we have palatine, lingual, pharyngeal, and tubal tonsils. So different areas where they are located. And what we notice that some of us have had issues with is inflammation of these tonsils. If they are inflamed, we talk about you having a tonsillitis. And this can be viral or bacterial infection. And usually you get really sore throat, you have trouble swallowing, they're really sensitive, and so on. The reason why we're worried about them is that we don't want them to grow too much, so we don't block this passageway for air to the lungs and for food to your stomach. So what we did kind of as a general solution to that earlier on, back in 90s, back in 80s, we just removed, if young children had tonsillitis regularly, we just chopped them off. And this chopping them off usually prevents that you don't get tonsillitis again. But they can grow back to a certain extent. But nowadays, we're kind of starting to ask that, well, maybe there is a reason that they're within the human body. Maybe because they're part of the lymphatic system, we shouldn't remove them. Maybe they serve a purpose. So we're being much more conservative about removing the tonsils. The next structure that I have to mention is going to be the Peyer's patches. They're just little dots, little patches within the small intestines, and especially further down when you have traveled further within the small intestines. Ileum and jejunum and ileum, that's where you end up finding the Peyer's patches. And their function is the same as we had for the tonsils, so kind of filter anything that shouldn't be there, the pathogens, and deal with those. The next one that I mentioned is going to be appendix. So appendix is the first part of the large intestines, this kind of a little pouch hanging out of there. And you can get your appendix inflamed. And if it's inflamed, we have a risk that it might rupture. So normally we go and get your appendix removed. Well, if you can have your appendix removed and still live perfectly fine, why would you have it in the first place? Well, the explanation is that most likely it's just an evolutionary remain. It's where back in the day when we ate more plant-based diet, the bacteria that's good for digesting plants was housed. If you think of cows, for example, cows eat grass. They've got multiple stomachs for this process of digesting plant-based diet because it takes a little bit more effort. So appendix serve the purpose that that's where we house those bacteria. But now that we eat less plant-based diet, the appendix keeps shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and eventually we probably get rid of it. We don't know exactly, that's the best theory that we have, but we don't know whether the appendix could have some sort of another function within the immune system. Maybe it's helpful and we just don't know it fully yet. So that's something that there's more work to be done to figure out. The final one that I want to mention is our thymus. So thymus was this site where the T cells went to mature. And thymus was also, we talked earlier on, it was the one that shrank over the age. It gets replaced by connective tissue and adipose tissue, so fat tissue. So in an older individual, in an adult, it's harder to find thymus than in a newborn or younger children. So those were our lymphatic organs. And what we next for this chapter was to go through the immune system. And I know that this lymphatic and immune system, they are tough chapters. So what I would propose that I will talk you through the immune system if you feel that that's helpful. Do you think that the lymphatic system makes more sense now, or is it still kind of a tough one?
I think now it makes sense.
Okay, good. Let's have a look of the immune system if you have a time and see just what might be throwing you off on that. And I really think that the immune system, the reason why you might be finding it tough is the fact that it's not actually anatomical structures. Immune system is all about function. There's no structures like we could before point out that, oh, this part and that part and this happens in that part. What immune system is pretty much fully physiology. So it just does things, but we don't really have structures as such that we can highlight in terms of them. Oh, it's located here and there. And really, to understand the immune system fully, we would need a couple of years. So this is going to be very general. So don't let that freak you out. We're going to keep it on the general level. And if you have time after we finish this, I will show you what kind of questions I could ask about it in the exam. So immune system was the function where the actually business end of what we talked about lymphatic system happened. It was where we were fighting against the diseases. So when there is a pathogen in your body and we need to fight against it, that's when the immune system gets activated. And you remember that it was the immune system that lived within the lymphatic system. So it was the pathogens that we fought against, an invader in the body that shouldn't be there. And pathogen actually is a word that comes from Greek. A lot of medical terms come. It means pathos, something that shouldn't be there, something that's an invader. And there's many different kinds of pathogens. They can be viruses, they can be fungi, they can be bacteria, they can even be parasites. So there's many different kinds of pathogens. Pathogen is just a general term that we use for all of these. So rather than saying that, oh, it can be this, or this, we just call them in general. All of them are pathogens. There's something that shouldn't be in your body. And this is where immune system becomes important. An immune system can be divided in two parts, into an innate and adaptive immunity. And we're going to start by looking at the innate immunity, and then we'll talk a little bit about the adaptive immunity. But this is going to be very general on both of those. If you want to have a good kind of a rule of thumb how these two differ, innate immunity acts on all kinds of pathogens. So it is not specific. It deals with anything, any kind of invader that shouldn't be in your body. Adaptive immunity instead is specific, so it deals with only certain kinds of pathogens. So innate deals with anything at all, whereas adaptive deals with only particular kinds. So sometimes we describe the adaptive immunity also as acquired immunity. That's the other term that sometimes gets used about it. And I think the acquired is a little bit better because it tells that you get it after having done something. And in this case, for adaptive immunity to work, you have had to face that pathogen before. And when you face that pathogen before and you face it for the second time, the adaptive system can deal with it. So that's the difference between the two. So let's focus on the innate immunity to start with. That's what we're going to look at initially. And innate immunity works with various lines of defense. And the first line of defense that we end up seeing is forming physical barriers. These physical barriers prevent these pathogens from entering into your body in the first place. If this pathogen cannot enter, you're going to be fine because it's not going to do damage if it doesn't get in at all. So some people compare it to these walls of a medieval fortress. They prevent a pathogen from getting in. And of course, good example of that would be our skin. It prevents that the various different kinds of pathogens can't enter in. If you do have a cut in the skin, that would be an issue. So any cut, any opening in the skin is a direct route for infection to get into your body. So for a pathogen to get into your body. So skin is the first line of defense that we have against pathogens. Second line of defense is not so much physical, but it's chemical barriers. And these chemical barriers, there's many different kinds that they can be. For example, your sweat contains certain elements that kill a lot of pathogens. So it is good to be a little sweaty that can kill something that tries to enter into your body that shouldn't. Same as stomach acid that we see here. Stomach acid is, the contents of the stomach are acidic in case you get something into your body with the food that you shouldn't have gotten. So you swallow something that can cause issues for you later on. Well, the first place where it travels is to the stomach, which is highly acidic, so it's likely to kill that pathogen before it has a chance to affect you. Another way how chemical second line defenses work is that our eyes are extremely poorly protected in a sense that many pathogens can enter into our body through the eyes. Same as if you deal with toxins, if you deal with toxic substances. That's why we always wear safety goggles. You can throw some toxin on your skin and it might burn, but you can wash it off. If you throw that same toxin to your eyes, it will actually get into your body much quicker. So eyes are really, really bad in terms of being protected. So that's where the chemical protection comes in. Your tears actually kill a lot of pathogens. So that's why we have constantly a small amount of the tears in our eyes, that liquid. And if you have something flying into your eye, you start tearing up. Well, that's because your body starts producing more tears that contain these chemicals that can kill the pathogens that are trying to get into your body through your eyes. And so on and so on. There's many other examples of these chemicals, chemical line of defense. Also, if you think your urethra is a direct route for pathogens to get in, so that's why we urinate, so we wash them away. We kind of get rid of them, and urine is also very good in terms of killing pathogens. If the first and second line of defenses don't work, if the pathogen has gotten into our body through our skin and we have not been able to kill it through other chemicals, then we need to bring in the cells. The cells need to deal with these pathogens. I'm just quickly going to say, I also forgot to mention the mucous membrane. Mucous membrane is same as the skin when it's inside our body. So inside our oral cavity, nasal cavity, and so on. So it's not skin, but it's the same layer that protects us. But if both of these fail, the physical barriers and chemical barriers, we are left with having to rely on our cells to deal with these. And the cells that we went through, and if you're kind of uncertain about these cells, you can look the full lecture video, so I'll give a very brief version. The first one that we're going to have a look is going to be phagocytes. What phagocytes do, they grab pathogen that we find in our body, and they actually kind of take it inside them and eat it. So here we have a pathogen, and a phagocyte takes the pathogen inside its cell. Inside the phagocyte cell, we have these small sacs of various different kinds of chemicals that can break down this pathogen. And this pathogen now gets killed and broken into small components that can be then kicked out of the phagocyte, and they're no longer harmful for the human body. So that's how phagocytes do. They find a pathogen, take it in, ingest it, break it apart inside them, and vomit out what's then the remaining particles of that are no longer dangerous to you. The next one is NK cells. NK stands for natural killer. And what natural killer cells do, they survey the body all the time for pathogens that shouldn't be there. And if they find a pathogen such as this, the yellow one is our natural killer cell, and the purple one is a pathogen, something that shouldn't be. What they do, they go to that cell, that pathogen that shouldn't be in your body, and they make that cell start something that's called apoptosis. What apoptosis is, it's almost like a command to a cell that tells that cell, you need to die. So it's almost like triggering suicide mode within this cell that gets activated. So NK cells survey around, and when they find a cell that shouldn't be in your body, they go there and they trigger that pathogenic cell commits a suicide. It commits a programmed cell death. So you can think of them, if you like, for example, Star Wars or others, that it's like going to the Death Star, pushing a button there, that it kills itself and then leaving. That's what natural killer cells do. The next one, the cell response that we're going to have a look of, is inflammation. Inflammation is a response to some kind of an injury to your body tissues. And what inflammation does, we have certain things that we see when you have an inflammation at some site, but overall, all of these things, they are beneficial for us because inflammation promotes your healing of that area. So it is considered that getting an inflammation, although you might be like, ooh, I hate when my, let's say, hand gets inflamed, but the inflammation helps that part of your body to heal, to get better, quicker and more effective. So what happens in an inflammation is that the inflammation stops the pathogen spreading to other parts of the body. So we really make it obvious that this part is inflamed. Let's stop it from spreading. So it works kind of as a self-isolating function. Another thing that inflammation does, it helps with removing these pathogens from that site. In addition, inflammation alerts rest of your immune system that, hey, we've got a problem here. Can someone come and help us? And in addition, inflammation, if you think inflammation, the inflamed site is usually warm, it's kind of tender to touch, it's red, it's sore. All of these help us with healing or repair processes. So inflammation really at large is very beneficial for us. It's a good thing to get inflammation when there is a pathogen, because that all promotes the healing of that site. And here I have a picture of an inflamed wrist, I think, and inflamed toes. And what I want to do, and what is going to be a question in your exam, is that what are the signs and symptoms of inflammation? So let's list them. So there's 4 or 5 different kinds of signs and symptoms depending on who you ask from. But the four first ones are things that we generally agree on. So first of all, if there's an inflammation somewhere, that area becomes very red. You can see both of these areas. They're very red. And the reason why they're red is that a lot of blood surges to that area. And the blood surges there because we want to make sure to get a lot of white blood cells to that area. So we carry a lot of those white blood cells with the rest of the blood to that area so they can fight against that pathogen. As that happens, this area also becomes usually very warm. If you touch an inflamed site, it is warmer than other parts of your body. That is because this blood is coming from the core of your body. So it is warmer at the very core of your body. And when this blood is now rushing to this site, it carries some of that heat with itself. That blood is still warm, so it travels there. So we end up noticing that it is warm at the site of inflammation as well. Other thing that we see is that the inflamed site also tends to swell. So it grows bigger. And this goes to what we just learned about the lymph nodes, that there's more stuff to this area. So there's more cells in this area. So if you have more cells, you need space for those cells, and this area swells. The fourth sign and symptom is going to be pain. These sites where you have an inflammation, it's usually very sore to touch. It hurts. And you might think that why is it good that I'm hurting? Well, it tells you not to use, it tells your body not to use that part that's inflamed. That part needs to get to rest and heal. So it kind of prevents us from using it, touching it. It gives it time to recover. And final function that sometimes gets listed is also that this part does not work as well as it would normally without inflammation. If we have one hand that's inflamed and another one that isn't, this hand is gonna be harder to use. It doesn't work as well. And again, this prevents us from using it and allows this site just to rest and recover. So these are the 5 signs and symptoms of an inflammation, and I would know them for an exam. The final 2 that I have, we have antimicrobial proteins. So these are often, these are our interferons. They deal with, again, pathogens as well. And then we have fever. Well, if you ask me, what is fever? Fever is abnormally or higher than normal body temperature. So we try to see that is your temperature higher than what it normally would be. If it is higher, you have a fever. Well, the question then would be that would it be good to have a fever or not? Well, fever actually is again beneficial in many ways. When your body temperature is a little higher than what it would normally be, that prevents a lot of the microbes from growing. So it helps, again, for these pathogens that have entered into your body, it helps us to stop them from growing. We say that, no, you should not be here. Let's not let you multiply and grow bigger, and we'll let our body to deal with you. We stop them temporarily. In addition, fever is actually when you increase a temperature at some site, the chemical reactions on that site happen quicker. So that's why when we are, for example, cooking something, we heat it up because that heat makes those chemical reactions that would happen normally to happen quicker. For example, when you cook eggs, the egg whites will solidify. Well, that's because they change their chemical structure and they change quicker when you heat it up. So metabolism was just a term for all chemical reactions that take place in your body. So if you have fever, they take place quicker, and these chemical reactions usually help you to get better. And finally, what fever also does, higher temperature does, that it promotes phagocytosis. Phagocytosis was this eating of a pathogen that shouldn't be in your body by a phagocytotic cell. So this cell, this big one that we see here, that's gonna find something that shouldn't be in our body. And let's say that what shouldn't be in our body is gonna be this green blob. So it's gonna eat it and then break it apart and get rid of it. So this is how the phagocytosis work. So it is a good thing to have increased phagocytosis. Some cultures, including where I'm from, we actually generate artificial fever by going to sauna. And with that artificial fever, we think that it has all these beneficial effects that we had with normal fever. So that's why many people consider that going to sauna might be beneficial. So that's the first part of the immune system chapter. And the second part of the immune system chapter looked at this adaptive branch. But before I go there, does it make sense now that we've gone through the immune system? Or is that still kind of vague?
It makes sense.
Okay, I'm glad. I know that it's probably a little hard. It does come from the fact that it is just a little bit more abstract, but this is the level of detail that you need to know.
Okay.
So let's have a look of this adaptive branch. And this is usually the part that students find a little bit more challenging. Again, to fully understand this, it does go beyond of what I can ask from you on this course. So don't feel that if it doesn't make sense, it's not because of you, it's because it is a topic that's so difficult and it's more than you need to be able to handle. So adaptive branch of the immunity was this branch that was specific for certain kinds of pathogen. So you need to deal with only certain kinds of pathogens if you're using your adaptive branch, whereas the innate branch that we saw before, that could deal with any kind of pathogen at all. So that's why the adaptive branch is sometimes called in other countries as acquired immunity. You first meet a pathogen, and then you meet it again, and the second time your adaptive immunity kicks in because you have acquired a plan how to deal with this pathogen. Now you have kind of a memory. You have something in your immune system that you have instructions how to deal with this pathogen. And this is where the B cells and the T cells become important. Trying to highlight, I can't get there. And I didn't mean to hide that. But this is where the B cells and the T cells are going to be important for us. They are how the adaptive immunity works. So we're going to be focusing on this branch now. And you'll notice if we look at these different kinds of cells that we have there, it is mainly the B and the T cells, and how these B and T cells then further get processed into special kinds of cells that work in the adaptive immunity. So what we saw earlier on, it is very specific. It only deals with certain kind of pathogens. And it is very effective when it works. It does its job really well. But to do its job really well, it has to have met that pathogen already once before. So it is only during the second exposure that the adaptive immunity works really well. So we talk about it as if it's needing to be primed. So this means that it has to have met this pathogen already once before it can act really efficiently for the second time. So it was very specific, so it can deal with particular pathogens much more efficiently. It knows what works really well for getting rid of this pathogen. And in addition, unlike our innate immunity, which acted only on one side, think of the inflammation, which was only on one side of your, or one part of your body. Adaptive immunity works in all parts of your body all at once. So it's systemic. It works throughout your entire body at the same time. So those are good things. And this third one can be both good and bad. It is that if you have met a pathogen before, you're able to deal with it very efficiently because you have developed a memory against it. But it's not going to be efficient the first time you meet that pathogen because you don't have that memory yet. So it is good only on the second time when you meet that pathogen. So how it works through various different mechanisms, through antibodies, B cells, T cells, and activation. And let's have a look at those. First thing that I want to discuss is the terms antigen and antibody. So antigen is what we discussed earlier on. We said that it was the pathogen that shouldn't be in your body. So antigens are something that's an invader that has gotten into your body and should not be there. Well, how we deal with antigens is that we use antibodies. These antibodies are things that attack, recognize, and then act on these pathogens. So if we have a pathogen that shouldn't be in your body, and your immune system recognizes it, it's also able to deal with it. So it is the antibodies that attack these antigens. So those are two important terms. And how I explain it to my students often is that we think of the antigens as these bluish big blobs and antibodies as much more numerous, smaller components that just float around in your body, doing surveillance, and also acting on the antigens if they run into those. So they're able to then deal with if they see something that's a pathogen that shouldn't be in your body. And how these two work together is that it is these antibodies that connect with the antigen. So they can say that, hi, I recognize that there is now something which was this antigen that shouldn't be in our body. I recognize that. But the thing is that not all antibodies can work with all antigens. These two need to be a match. They need to be almost like a lock and key mechanism. Only certain antibodies can act on certain antigens. And if there is a good fit, then they are able, the antibodies, to recognize that, hey, this antigen shouldn't be here, and they're able to act on it. If it's a wrong kind of antibody, it just isn't able to connect to this antigen. So they need to be a match. And there's actually many different kinds of these antibodies. We show in your textbook only these kind of Y-shaped structures that I've drawn here. It looks a little bit like a Y. But these can be many different shapes, but we're not going to worry about it just now. Well, next thing that we have left is to talk about B cells and T cells. And remember that the B cells, they matured at the bone marrow, T cells matured at the thymus. We have a third kind of cell group that we'll talk a little bit more just at the very end. But how B cells and T cells work and what happens throughout their entire life. Let's go through that together. Both B and T cells, they start their life within the red bone marrow. Then once their life has started there, they go to that site where they're matured. B cells went to the bone marrow, and T cells went to the thymus. And while they are within the bone marrow or the thymus, they become able to work all the functions that your immune system has. In addition, they become able to tell that this part is part of your normal body, this part is a pathogen. So it's able to separate what it needs to deal with, kill, and what it needs to leave alone. So during this maturation process within the bone marrow or thymus, there's a selection process. And certain B cells are selected and certain T cells are selected based on their ability to do these two things. And then they travel to the secondary lymphoid organs. They travel wherever the places of the lymphatic system that we covered earlier on. The lymph nodes, spleen, tonsils, appendix, thymus, pairs, patches, and so on. Now, once they have been on these secondary lymphoid organs, they start to circulate throughout your body. And if they meet an antigen while they're circulating throughout your body, that meeting of the antigen causes these either B or T cells to continue their development. So they keep developing further because they've met something that shouldn't be there. They've met a pathogen. And what it does, the first thing that it does in terms of its development is that they're going to multiply in numbers. We make a lot of copies of this B or T cells so that we have many to deal with this pathogen that we didn't want to have. And then they can also become activated, so they can act against that invader. So these B or T cells see that this dude shouldn't be here, this pathogen. They multiply in numbers, so we have lots of them, and they act on it. Some of these cells also become memory cells, so they're left behind after this encounter has been dealt with and we've gotten rid of this pathogen. Most of these B cells and T cells then just go and die. We don't need them anymore. We can let them go. But some remain circulating in your body as memory cells. It is these memory cells that make you having this immunity against something that you've met before. So that was our B and T cells. And the last cells that we have to discuss are antigen-presenting cells, APCs. These cells can't really deal with this pathogen. Themselves, they are only able to grab this pathogen and show it to other cells that can deal with this pathogen. They're only kind of doing like tagging it, that, hey, here's something that we shouldn't have. Can someone come and deal with it? So they're called antigen-presenting cells. They just show that antigen to everyone else. And then these other cells come and deal with that pathogen. So that's really the difference between the two branches of the immune system. And the last thing that I want to talk about is having this memory against something that you've seen before. So when you first meet a pathogen, it takes about 3 to 6 days before any reactions start that you can start to see them in your body, that you start getting sick because you met a pathogen. And it's usually around the day 10 when you are the most sick. So it takes about a week, a little longer than a week, to deal with this pathogen when you meet it for the first time. And how you deal with it is through immunoglobulins. They're just, you can think of them that they are a response. And the response is there, but it's not super strong. But if you meet this pathogen for the second time, now we have these memory cells. So this is now quick response. It's only within hours that we are able to start responding to that you get sick much quicker. The peak sickness takes place within a couple of days, and the response is super strong. All of this is thanks to these memory cells and developing the memory against this pathogen. But for this to happen, you must have met it before. So the second response is much better, much more effective, but it has to be that you've met it before. So you have developed this memory against it. And this graph, I think, explains it quite nicely. This is when you meet the pathogen for the first time. So this axis is the time. You meet the pathogen for the first time here. It takes about a week, and then the peak response is around the day 10. This is the amount of response that you have. So it is a response. It takes a little longer, and it's not quite as strong of a response as the second response would be. Let's look at the second response. What happens in the second response? Here we meet that pathogen, and almost immediately, so only within hours, you start to develop a response. In a couple of days, it is the peak response, which is much bigger, and this response remains strong in your body for longer as well. You notice how this came down really quickly. The second encounter, quick action, strong action, and remains as strong for a longer time. That's all thanks to developing this memory against a certain kind of pathogen. And we can make this memory in various different ways. You can just meet that pathogen that bacteria or that virus that gets into your body, and we deal with that pathogen. We can also give you that pathogen by giving you a vaccine. This vaccine is developing this memory for you so that when you meet it for the second time, you're able to deal with it much more effectively. So what we do with vaccines is that we give only a little amount of this pathogen, or we might give you this pathogen, but we make that pathogen very weak, or we only give part of that pathogen for you. But by doing so, you develop this memory against it, and when you meet it for reals, the next time, you're able to have this secondary response, which was quick and strong. So that's why we all are getting vaccinated against COVID, that if we meet it after we've gotten the vaccination, we're going to get this secondary response really quickly, really strong, and it's going to be effective, rather than having to rely on the first exposure. That's why we also said that being exposed to it once might protect you against getting the COVID again. That was the logic, how we worked it out. Some other ways how you can become immune, get these memory cells, is that you can get them from mother. So through the mother's blood, through the placenta, or through the breast milk. That's why it's so important to breastfeed the newborn, because all of these secondary memory cells that the mother has, they get passed to that child. That child doesn't have this secondary memory against pathogens because it's never met any. But as long as you keep breastfeeding that child will be protected because it's getting these memory cells. The other way how we could do it, we could just inject serum from the person. And the reason why we talked about all this immune system is that it's most relevant for us in terms of the organ transplants. And you can have transplants from many kinds of sources. You can transplant, for example, skin from one part of your body to another part. We can transplant blood vessels from one part of your body to another part. For example, coronary artery bypass, we take a little blood vessel from elsewhere in your body and move it there, so that you have good blood supply to the heart. What's most common is that we transplant organs from one individual of that species to another individual of that species. So, for example, when a human dies, we can take many organs from that dead person and give them to other people who need those organs. That's the most common kind of organ transplant. Sometimes we do transplantations from an animal to a human, for example. Big heart valves are very common that we take because you just don't have that many heart valves available, but you have a lot of pigs available. So let's take theirs and put it into a human and hope that it works. Well, the number of transplants that we do, the numbers have remained fairly same, even though this is a little old data. The most common transplants that we see are the kidney transplants. Those are the most common. The second most common are the liver transplants. And the reason why these two are the common ones is that because you've got two kidneys, you can give away one and still live perfectly fine. So it's not hard to find kidney donors. Also, you can cut away a lot of your liver and pretty soon it will grow back. So it's not that big of a deal to donate your liver, part of your liver, to someone else. Well, the third and fourth, they are big deal. So you only have one heart and you only have two lungs. So you can't really give away those. But because you cannot live without a heart and lungs, that's why they're so common transplants. So it's not that it's easy to do, but you just simply need them. I think that the fifth on the list was pancreas again, because it is important. Well, if we look what happens over time after you've gotten that transplant, it turns out that by the time we get to the year 10, almost 50% of these transplants have failed. So you can think that that's really sad, that after 10 years, it's quite likely that you need to get another transplant. But at the same time, this individual has gotten 10 years of extra life. So it's a balance between those two. Where organ transplants really relate to what we just talked about, the immune system, is that when you transplant one piece of someone's body to another individual, or you transplant a piece of another animal to a human, you have to be able to manipulate the immune system, because what your immune system does immediately, it says that this is a pathogen, this shouldn't be in your body. So your immune system deals with that unless you switch it off. So what we end up doing when we give someone an organ transplant, we switch off their immune system. This helps us that your body doesn't attack against that transplant organ that we've given to this individual. The problem is that then your body won't attack against of any other pathogen either. So individuals who have received an organ transplant, they're very vulnerable. They can usually die from just a simple cold, simple flu can kill them because their immune system is now switched off. There were a couple of immunodeficiencies. So when your immune system does not work correctly, and I listed those, Hodgkin's disease is an issue with cancer of B cells, so your lymph nodes don't work correctly. HIV is an issue with helper T cells. Again, you get many kinds of symptoms, and eventually you die from weakened immune system. So normal cold, normal flu can be cause of death, most commonly in HIV. We have certain autoimmune diseases where your body, your immune system, attacks your normal body. It thinks that you, yourself, the parts of you that you're a threat to your body. So it's no longer able to separate yourself from a pathogen. And I've listed a bunch of those there: rheumatoid arthritis, myasthenia gravis, MS, Graves' disease, type 1 diabetes, lupus, and then kidney issues. So those are examples when your body is no longer able to tell itself from the pathogen. And how do we treat them? Well, if you have this problem that your body keeps attacking your healthy cells, let's again turn off your immune system. That works well, but again, you become vulnerable for normal cold, normal flu, that can be death of you. But there's a lot of research going on this field, and I'm optimistic that it will get better. And the last one that I wanted to mention was when you are hypersensitive. So your immune system attacks like crazy against something that it should attack, but it shouldn't be that big of a deal. So allergies are an example of pathogens that enter to your body. And yes, we need to deal with them and get rid of them. But rather than just dealing with it and getting rid of them, your body goes crazy and starts attacking super strong this small threat. So that's why you get these allergic reactions. They're over the top. Anaphylactic shock is worse version of an allergy. So it's totally over the top response to something that's not really a big deal. So that can be another example. And that's all you need to know about lymphatic and immune system. I know that that's a lot to take in, and I know that it can be a challenging chapter. So what I recommend that you do is that you have a look through the study guide that I prepared, and it lists very carefully what you need to know. What could the possible questions be in the exam from these chapters? I don't know if you have time to stick around. If you have, I'm happy to go through the study guide for the immune system and lymphatic system as first to kind of clarify that. If you have to go, there will be a video available of the study guide.
I think I have time. We can go ahead.
Perfect. Let's do that. So to do that, what I'm gonna do is that I'm gonna pause the recording or stop the recording and restart it so that we have the review of the chapter on lymphatic and immune system on one video, and then on the second video we have a review of the study guide. So don't wonder, that's what I'm doing.